Zimmerman, second-degree murder trial. The judge, Deborah Nelson, hearing arguments pro and con whether or not to allow one of the defense witnesses, John Donnelly, whether or not to allow his testimony to be used as part of this case because he violated what's called the sequestration rule that calls for witnesses to avoid watching the trial and talking about the case until they had been excused from the trial. He had not yet been excused. This is important because he had made the point that it was George Zimmerman's voice on that 911 audio tape that was crying out for help, and he's a Vietnam War combat medic who has heard people crying out for help many times. All right, stand by. We'll go back into the courtroom shortly. Meantime, earlier, a dummy had a cameo role in the George Zimmerman trial earlier in the day. Both defense and prosecution lawyers straddled a mannequin to try to demonstrate the fatal fight between Zimmerman and Trayvon Martin. It happened during a questioning when they were questioning a witness who's an expert on the use of force. Watch and listen to this.
George Zimmerman, Trayvon Martin. Were the injuries on Mr. Zimmerman's back of his head consistent with someone doing this on cement?
I don't think so.
How about this? How about somebody resisting the attempt? The injuries, the two lacerations, could that have come from cement? If somebody was resisting me pushing down like this?
I believe so. I believe it was a culmination of downward force, whether it was from pushing or striking, and I know clearly by the injuries to his face, and that would drive him back, his head striking hard into the concrete.
Would you expect, based upon your training and experience, that somebody getting their head struck on the cement would attempt to resist it happening?
Of course, they would. Normal human instinct would try to move away from the pain stimulus, which would just create another gap to be driven back.
And would that occur not only the first time, but every subsequent time?
Whether it's a push or a strike, every time you drive a strike or push straight downward, the body goes until it hits an object that'll stop it.
You recognize this as being a human-type figure, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. It's actually got a belly button, right?
It surely does.
Does it appear to be anatomically correct?
For the belly button, yes, sir.
All right. So, as the defendant described it to you, is this the way he described it, in the area of his belly button?
Well, what's really important right now, sir, number one, you've got your knees up pretty high in his waist. If you want to slide down just a little bit more so that you're in the, there you go. Have a squat. I can't see your crotch, but in the area of his belly button, yes, sir.
Well, here's his belly button. Am I in the area?
Yes, sir.
Okay. By the way, did you have the defendant do this?
No, sir.
When you talked to him, you didn't have him do that?
No, sir.
Okay. If this person, this mannequin, were carrying a firearm on their waist, where would the gun be right now in relation to me?
Would be at your left inner thigh.
Right here, right?
Yes. If he was right-handed, it would be at your left inner thigh. Yes, sir.
Right. Underneath my leg.
Yes, inside your leg.
Okay. Were you aware that the defendant described to his best friend that when he slid down, the defendant slid down, that Trayvon Martin was up around his armpits? Were you aware of that?
No, I've not heard that. No, sir.
Okay. Well, where would the gun be now?
Now the gun would be behind your left leg.
Okay.
Significant point. Let's discuss what we just saw in those two demonstrations. Martin Savage is with us, our legal analyst, former federal prosecutor Sonny Hostin, and the defense attorney Mark Nejame. Sonny, if his knees were above George Zimmerman, Trayvon Martin, it would be hard. The state is arguing for him to reach inside his pant where his gun was and get to it and then shoot him if he were on top of it. That's the whole point of the demonstration from the state attorney.
That's right, and it would just show that inconsistency, the physical impossibility of Zimmerman's story, and that's been thematic for this prosecution. I mean, not only would Trayvon Martin not have been able to grab it, he wouldn't have been able to see it. Remember, in one of George Zimmerman's statements, he shot Trayvon Martin is because Trayvon Martin, one, either saw the gun and was reaching for it or saw the gun and tried to grab it. It's a bit difficult to see a gun that is behind your leg. And that was one of the first accounts that he gave his best friend. So the notion is, why would you lie to your best friend? Perhaps this is really what happened. So I think the prosecution did a very good job of taking what was a defense witness and turning him into a prosecution witness.
The argument being, Mark, that if Trayvon Martin's knees, if your legs were over his shoulders, he wouldn't be able to reach in and get that gun. Who got the better of those two demonstrations, in your opinion, Mark?
Well, I think it was a bit of a draw, but I think what we really saw come out of that, Wolf, is that the state changed its prosecutorial tactic, because they realized, you know, for the first 3/4 of this case, the opening argument all throughout, they basically were trying to indicate that it was George Zimmerman who was on top of Trayvon Martin. Now, with the way that they portray this, they're pretty much conceding that it was, in fact, George Zimmerman on the bottom. They know that they've lost that issue. So now you see a transition going on, and they're trying to establish that, in fact, maybe Trayvon Martin was trying to get away, and hence that has to do with the 90-degree angle that they keep on referencing now. So they've really changed up their tactic, a good, smart thing to do. They need to be flexible. If they'd continued on the road, though, that it was, in fact, Trayvon Martin who was on the bottom, they would have no chance. They've now transitioned, and they're now trying to take the facts that they believe that the jury is believing and make them follow a direction that they hope that they can get a conviction on.
The private investigator, the expert who was testifying, named Dennis Root, Martin, I want you to listen to what he said in the course of his testimony about this altercation between Trayvon Martin and George Zimmerman.
We have a golden rule that if you have not successfully completed the fight, if you have not won the fight in 30 seconds, change tactics, because the tactics you're using aren't working. The average person's adrenaline dump, the endorphins that get pumped in under stress, within 30 seconds, you've depleted just about everything you have as far as giving 100% of your physical ability. If you haven't physically been able to succeed in the first 30 seconds, from that point forward, you are now diminishing on return physically. In this particular case, just going off, the timeline of the 911 call, given the period of time, and I personally have sat there and timed it myself, where it's about 40 seconds of time. That's a very long time to be involved in any kind of physical altercation. And that most certainly plays into the decision-making of any individual involved.
Martin, the argument he was making is that that 40 seconds could be an eternity, and if it was self-defense, if he thought he was saving his own life, George Zimmerman, reaching out, getting that gun, may in fact have been justified. I guess that's the upshot of what Dennis Root is trying to say. I wonder if that was your reading of his testimony.
Yeah, I think it was. I mean, I was very surprised as to how long that witness actually was on the stand. I mean, I think it was quite clear, as Sonny pointed out, that the prosecution was sort of able to take his testimony and really bend it to their advantage. And I'm not sure why he was called at all, because he certainly was no Dr. Vincent DeMaio. That was the expert that the defense called yesterday. And many people believe that he really nailed it on the part of the defense, as showing quite clearly that the body, Trayvon Martin's body, was the key evidence that verified George Zimmerman's story here. So you had that very powerful witness. That could have been the time for the defense to essentially say, that's it, we rest. But they didn't. They brought this person on. It went on for hours. He had mixed statements about what he really was able to determine, and you weren't quite sure what sort of expert was he. What is a use of force expert? So I'm not sure that they gained a lot by putting him on the stand. I'm talking about the defense.
Yeah. All right, stand by. Everyone stand by. We're going to continue to monitor what's happening inside the courtroom right now. They're arguing whether or not some key testimony from earlier in the week should be allowed to remain testimony for the jurors to consider, even though the person who delivered that testimony, John Donnelly, a Vietnam War combat medic, violated what's called that sequestration rule to avoid watching the trial, talking about the case until he had been excused. We're listening to the judge, Deborah Nelson. We're monitoring what's happening inside. Also, a former neighbor of George Zimmerman gives emotional testimony about her terror when someone broke into her home. How might that have swayed the jury? Stand by for that as well. And later, the former Sanford, Florida police chief speaking out for the first time. He's telling CNN why he resisted pressure to arrest George Zimmerman.